Great. A very good evening to everyone, especially on a Friday evening. I guess I want to thank you first because I know every one of you probably has just gone back home and probably want to have an early dinner and crash. But thank you for spending time with us in the STC India chapter webinar. We're going to talk about REST API documentation best practices, and I want to thank and a very good morning to Marta. She's based out in California, USA, and before I do that, just wanted to tell you a couple of things. One is that I have taken off the microphone rights for participants because there are a few disturbance that was happening. But as and when you have a question, you can type it in the chat box, or maybe later, once the session gets over, I will, since I'm recording the webinar, I will open the podium to the people for discussion, and I'll also enable the microphone right for participants. Now, to start off with today's webinar, we had close to 130 people who have registered on the webinar. Today's webinar is on REST API documentation best practices. And basically, what Marta will strive to achieve is that she will talk about how REST API is growing and technical communicators can increase their marketability and value to their company by learning more about them. Marta works in a development team at Oracle, where she architects and leads mobile, cloud, and REST API projects. She is a well-known international speaker who has presented and has been a regular presenter for conferences and webinars. She publishes articles for STC, IEEE, HCI, and CIDM best practices. She is an STC fellow and has received close to 15 awards for her projects at the regional and international level. She participates in the Silicon Valley chapter and was previously a member of the nominating committee. She judges International Summit Awards and was STC's 2016 Summit Tools and Development Track Manager, which recently got concluded at Anaheim. She holds a degree from Stanford University and certificate from Notre Dame de Namur and University of California. So without much ado, I welcome Marta, and please start the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, and thanks to STC India for hosting me. And I really want to welcome everybody on the call. I know this is really late for most of you, and we have some folks early in the US. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm Marta Rauch, and I'm very happy to bring this information to you today that can help you with your own projects. And whether you're working on REST APIs already, or whether you're about, you're about to start soon, and really help satisfy your developer audience. So let's get started. Here's my Twitter ID and the hashtag if you're on social media, and my company's safe harbor statement. And here's our agenda, what I wanted to share with you today. And first, we'll just talk about a little introduction and why REST APIs are so important, and then some best practices for REST API content. And these are best practices developed from industry research, from also from best practices developed at my company that we put into place, and I'll show you some examples of that. I'll give a demo then, how one company does this, and show you a nice REST API interface that's satisfied developer customers, and then I'll share some useful tools. And after that, I'm going to share some, where to go from here, wrap up ways you can learn more. So as we go through, please listen in for your top takeaways, things that you think will be useful for you, that you can bring back to your workplace, when you're finished, something that will help you solve a problem, or some kind of insight, or something that will, just a tip that will make things easier for you. Okay, and so I'm going to ask people to share at the end, and at the end, I'm going to ask you to type into the chat in the webinar, or you can, I think that's how we'll do it. Just type into the chat. I'll ask for that toward the end. So a little bit about the importance of REST APIs. Why do we care so much? APIs, first of all, stands for an application programming interface. And this really lets all kinds of products and services communicate with each other. Whether some examples are cloud services, one cloud talking to another cloud, mobile apps, wearable apps. So how does your wearable app connect to your a product? Managing social networks, Internet of Things. Those are some of the ways that APIs are important for us today. And REST, of course, stands for Representational State Transfer. And this is an architecture for client-server web communication. And why do we care about REST in particular? It's growing very quickly, and it's quickly becoming an industry standard. They're very fast and reliable, and they're useful for all these types of use cases that I mentioned: the cloud, mobile, wearables, Internet of Things, and many more things. They're growing really quickly. This is a graph from Programmable Web. You may have seen this before if you're interested in REST APIs. This is the growth in web APIs since 2005, and you could just see it's just a really fast growth. And so, our employers want us to learn more about this. And just to highlight a few of the fast-growing categories, and this is a survey from Programmable Web, and it's kind of an older survey, but it just gives you a sense of some of the types of categories that are, people are developing APIs for. Some of them are financial, enterprise, payments, messaging, government, mapping, science, and social. So if you're working in any of those areas, you're definitely going to be working with APIs. And API docs turn out to be really critical. This is a great survey that Adam DeVander did, again for Programmable Web, and he asked a bunch of developers, okay, so you're working on APIs, what's your most important factor for, being able to work with them and being happy with them? And you can see here, the number one thing was documentation, complete and accurate documentation. So that was even above service availability, service responsiveness. It's just amazing to see that that was so important. So complete and accurate, that's what developers want, and they're our audience. So everybody on this call is in the right place, learning about this and ramping up so you can satisfy your audience and really make your company happy. So with that introduction, to just make sure we're on the same page, here are some of these best practices. And as I mentioned, these are developed. A lot of this comes from a lot of research that my company did. There was a group at my company that focused on this several years ago, and did a bunch of looked at a lot of different the best APIs out there, and then made some user interfaces and got a lot of input on that, and finally came up with something that worked very well for our customers. So I'm going to share some of these things with you, and this is a summary, and we'll go through each one of these one by one, and then there will be a summary slide at the end. The main points are to really help developers get started quickly, and I'll show some tips for that. Include useful reference information, because that's really what they need. That's the nuts and bolts. And it's really useful to provide sample code, and I'll show some points about that. And then you're going to want to provide a list of REST endpoints for easy access, and represent your resources with a description language if you can do that. And that's machine readable, and it enables you to automate your REST API documentation. And ideally, if you can, it would be really great if you can provide a modern usable user experience or user interface. And I know that's not always possible, but just do the best you can with the tools that you have. So here's some ways to help developers get started quickly. And this is, by the way, there's links at the bottom of these slides at the bottom right. Those are, if you go to the slides, you can click those and go right to the example that I'm showing on this slide. So this happens to be the REST API for Oracle Java Cloud Service. And the first thing to do to help them get started quickly, is this, the developers are asking, is this the right thing? Should I spend my time on this? Is this going to help me achieve my goals? And so you say, why should I use this API? And you can see about, there it is in the about, it tells you you can create and manage these cloud service instances. It's an alternative to the web base. So right there, they know, okay, so this is something that I will find useful, and I can now delve down. So you can see that that's at the very top there. And by the way, in this interface that I'm showing you, the table of contents is on the left, and you can easily collapse that to get more room for the actual API information. So I'll show that in the demo, how you can do that. So it's really nice to provide a quick start. Just really quickly help developers get started on a few key tasks, and they're going to need to know certain information. So first of all, this is a boilerplate. In my company, we have templates for this, and people can fill them out and publish them. So the quick start tells you how to what you need to know. For example, in our Oracle Cloud, they need to have a subscription. And then here is another part of the quick start. It tells you the URL structure. So you're going to need to give them that basic path, and it's there in the gray shaded box. And that's the basic structure. And then all the resources will be built on that. And it defines that. And it shows the supported methods for, here are the HTTP methods, get, post, put, delete. And then really what that means for the API. So for example, get is a regular get a method, and then this is what you're doing. You're retrieving information about the Oracle Java Cloud API. And here's just a summary of some typical HTTP methods used in REST. The get is retrieve, like when you are on a web page and you put in a URL. The post is a create, so you add something. Maybe when you're filling out a form on a web page, that is posting some information. Put is update, and delete is delete. And so there's an example on the right of how this applies in one particular API. Authentication or authorization is really important to put up front. So make sure that they have no snags here and they know exactly what they need. Now this is particular to every different product. So you need to really get the details from your team. This is just one example here. So just make sure that that's up front, and that whatever you need to provide there is easy for them to access, and you explain all the details. Another thing to put in the get started or up front is how to deal with the different status codes that they're going to see, and if they get errors, what would they do here? And these are HTTP status codes, but again, what does this mean for this particular API? So make sure that you fill that out and add what's particular for your product. What's really important is to include kind of some key tasks and tell people how to get started with them. This is a list of use cases. This is a template that we have, and I recommend maybe the top 5 or so. This particular API has a lot of different tasks, so you can see a lot of them there. But for a smaller API, you might not have so many, so it doesn't have to be a long list. But it's those typical main things that your customers are going to need to do. So for this, how will you know? You could ask your product manager, or maybe a developer or an architect. Someone on your team is going to know, here are the key tasks, and then just step them through this. And you can see here that they list a task in a table, and then there's a link to find out all the details. And then, so those are some getting started tips. And now here are some tips for the reference information. And you can see they're under a task heading in our template. And that's really nice, because these are actual, tasks that developers are going to be doing. And you can see here's one, view a backup. So I like the way this is organized under tasks, and then what we're calling them, these main headings are we're calling them categories. And then here's all the tasks that you can do here. So it describes the task and so on. As I said, these are grouped into categories, a really nice thing to do, because this just makes content more readable, and your customers can browse that. And after they learn which topics they need to do, and how after they navigate, it's really nice to be able to remove this real estate, this table of contents. So just by clicking, it's really nice to enable that to get out of the way, so developers can see more of the information they need to, they're needing to use. So here's an example of a topic. This one's view a backup. And here's some of the types of information that you're going to want to include. The name of it, and then this one is view a backup, and the method. And this time it's get. And then here's your URL structure. And you can see in braces there, those are things that they'll actually plug in their specific information. And then there's an overview of it, a brief overview, just what they need to know. And then the parameters. And then this is a kind of a nice template that we developed. It's actually accessible. This is an accessible way to provide this information. So for people who are blind, this turns out to be a nice layout and template for them to get the information. And so there are the parameters, the information about them, like the type, is it a string, and whether it's required. That's really useful. That's something people need to know when they're using it. And then any information, notes, and information that they need, like, for the backup ID. Okay, so how do they get that? And then there's a way to find that. Okay, so that's the type of information you would include in one of these kind of reference topics. And they're task-based, but they provide all the need-to-know information. And one thing that's really great to do, is if you can do this, if you have a web layout, this is really ideal. Provide quick access to the request and the response. A tabbed UI is great. It just improves usability. And this is based on feedback from user studies. And for example, this is the request tab, and then they can quickly click over to the response tab. If you're not, people ask me, so what can I do? I don't have the ability to make a web API, web user interface for my API. And you can just make those headings in a guide, and then they could scan through that or click to that heading. But it's just really nice if you can do this. Here's an example of a response in the response tab. So what to do, with the different responses you could get. So that's another nice thing to be able to do if possible. So those were some key reference points. And so we looked at getting started. We looked at reference information to include. And here is information about, here is a tip to provide sample code. And this is really, really great for developers because it helps them understand how they would use it in the real world. But it also helps them, they can copy and paste and then change that information as necessary. So it's always easier to start, from an example instead of code it yourself. So provide these in languages used by your customers. And here we see in the gray box, there's a curl command. So this is a sample of how to run this using curl. And that's a command line interface. And they can just copy and paste this and update it. So you may have other languages used by your customers. So how do you know? You're just going to have to check with your team. And maybe your customers are using Groovy or Java or something else. So if you find out that there's a whole bunch of languages, then you can prioritize those. Maybe you can't put them all in at once, but try to put the ones start with the ones that are used by most people, and then you can gradually add those in as you have time and resources. It's really great to provide example requests and responses like you see here. And this just helps them, just really helps them work with your API. And one thing that's important is to actually test this sample code. And this can be really hard to do because sometimes you're working under a deadline, but it's really important to build this in. And we found that it's really important to build in a test team for this. Not only test the API itself, but test the sample code and see if that works. And again, that can take some time. So, try to, if you don't have that on your team right now in your schedule, make sure you plan for that. And again, this is really helpful for developers. It helps them understand the use cases, and it also helps them get started. So another really key thing to do is to provide a list of the REST endpoints. And this is one example of how they can look. It just gives developers another way to access that information. One way is by scanning through under the tasks in the table of contents. Another way is to just look at the endpoints. And you can see on this template at the top right, top left, that this is, one of the first things that they see. So they know they can learn about it, they can look at all the REST endpoints, and that really helps them scan through it. Another really cool thing, if you can do that, is to provide the ability to sort. So this is something that our users ask for. So task, they can sort by task, they can sort by path, that URL, or they can sort by method. So that's a really neat way to do it. And then we also added the ability to group by API if they want. So this is just a great thing to do, and so make sure you include this. Those are two key things to add about and then the REST endpoints, in addition to the get started that we talked about, and then kind of the task and the reference information there. One other really great thing to do is to represent resources with a description language. And this allows your documents to be automated and generated, which has worked really well. This is what my company set this up, and it works really well for us. So that way that you make sure that always the code matches the docs. There's no lag behind. And I'll show a little bit more about that in a second. Here's an example. This is Swagger 2.0, as you can see up in the top. This is one description language. It's now called actually Open API Specification. And lastly, it's really great if you have the ability to provide a modern, usable user experience and an interface. It's ideal if you can have an interactive web user interface like this. And I'll show you a demo of it in a minute, and then you can play around with it on your own to kind of get a feel for how this, this relates to like the Swagger and so on. But this really, as I said, developers can click around, they can get quick access to resources and examples, they can see the endpoints, they can remove the table of contents, they can have a lot of flexibility, and it's very useful. So if you can do that, I know not everybody has the ability, but if you can, this is really sort of a goal to look toward. And one really neat thing that we ended up doing, my company provides a catalog, an API for the APIs. And this API is basically a way to just get information about other APIs. It's just a way to access them all in one place. And this particular one is actually free. You just have to have a cloud service description. And it helps you discover APIs. And I'll show you in a second. I'll show you in the demo. They're machine readable. So this is an example. We have two ways to look at these. This is like a web interface where you can actually manually click around and look at the Swagger files. And what's nice about the Swagger 2.0, it lets developers create code stubs that they can then use in their own projects. And it really helps them integrate, because this is going to be all the APIs in one place for the company, all the ones that are available. And then, in addition to that web interface that I just showed you, here's the REST API. And of course, it has the same kind of interface as the other API content. And basically, all these, all the tasks are getting information. So before we go to the demos, I just want to summarize some of these best practices. Really spend some thought on how you can help your developers get started quickly, get them up to speed with all the key information that they need. And then useful reference information that includes, everything that they need. And I showed an example topic and showed what types of things to include there. And then it's really key to provide sample code and, ideally in the languages that your developers use. And remember to provide a list of REST endpoints so that will enable really quick access to all the tasks that they have available to them in the API. Ideally, you want to represent your resources with a description language, and I showed the Swagger 2.0. And that's machine readable, and it also, so it helps you you can work toward automating and generating your content. Provide a modern, usable user experience, if possible. Not everyone has the ability to do that. Okay, so those are some of the best practices. And now let's look at how one company does this. And I'm going to now just show you. See, I want to show the Java REST API. Let's see. Hold on. Okay, so, well, here's the catalog. I'll show you this one for now. This one, it gives some information here. Click the table of contents. And by the way, you can just expand or collapse that. And then this is about, where you see, here's what this lets you do, so they can quickly see, is this the API that I want to use? And then you can see all the REST endpoints by clicking this. And this shows you, in this case, they're all gets, because the API cloud service, you're just looking at things. You're not posting to anything, you're just viewing. So these are all gets. You can sort by path, method. You can group by APIs or not. Again, this includes a quick start, and it tells you how to install curl, and so on. It includes information about send requests, and here's the URL structure. Here are the supported methods, and the media types and the supported headers. So this is the information that you need. Here's the authentication information. Now this particular one doesn't require authentication, but usually you will have it, so this is important to include in your Get Started. And here's a list of status codes, and not just what they mean in for HTTP, but what do they mean for your API? And then here's a nice thing that's in our templates, how to access with curl. So this gives the information that you need to use that. And so this is all the getting started information. Now, here under tasks, these are the different categories. And this is an overview topic. And you can click one of these to go directly to that topic, or you can click in the table of contents. So here is how to retrieve something. This is an example of your request. Here's your response. This is the type of response you could possibly get, and examples. Here's this is kind of nice. It's in a You can scroll through this, you can copy and paste. Here's an example of the request header and response. So here's some more tasks that you can do with this API and some additional tasks. Okay, so that's an example of the REST API for the catalog cloud service. And then I want to show you that here is an example of one of the code stubs that you can get when you're looking at the cloud. See, here's the overview of it. Here's the user interface where you can go and just browse around. So if I search for Java, here's the Oracle Java Cloud Service that I showed in the slides. Here's one of the categories. You remember we were looking at backups. So I can click Get Swagger, and this will show me the machine-readable Swagger 2.0. This will show me all the Swagger code that went into this particular, the backups. So here you can see title backups. Here's the description and so on. This is something that a developer could use for their own code. So that's a quick demo, and I have here, let me just see if I can open this one up. This is the Java Cloud Service. This is the one that I was demonstrating where in the screenshot. So this shows the about. This shows all the REST endpoints. You can sort by task, method, group by API or not. Here's all the get started information. And this, by the way, this get started part here, this is all content that's developed at our company. This is developed by technical writers, information developers, and they developed this in XML and DITA format. And they place their files, they use a template, and they place the files in GitHub. And then all this task information that you see here, this is basically coming from information from the code. So here's some examples, you know, of the backup topics we were looking at. And here's what it looks like. Here's a request. You can click quickly between the request and the response. So you're making a request. What response should I get? There it is. And here's some examples again. So here's the curl that they could use in the command line. One nice thing that we have here is this download button. So if you want to download the Swagger and take a look at what it looks like for this REST API for Java Cloud Service, you can just click that, and here it is. Click download, and you can look between this. Here's the title. This describes it. This is all the Swagger code that went into making these tasks here. Okay, so let me go back, and I put some links to some other different cloud services. So let me just quickly show, get back to slides. Let me show just an overview of how we ended up doing this. And there's a team at my group that developed this process, a team at my company that developed this process to automate the generation of API docs. So developments include the required information in the API description for each resource included in the API. And they do that in one of the frameworks recommended to Oracle teams, and those are Swagger 2.0 or JSON Schema Hypermedia. And then we use a REST API publishing app to register and publish those APIs. So you can see on the left, those two boxes, they use one of those description languages. Then it's transformed into one canonical description language, which is Swagger 2.0. And then from there, the publishing app converts the HTML from the REST templates, and it publishes the HTML on the Help Center. And then here's just a way, a quick, an overview of how the information is coming. So the Oracle authoring systems, that's the technical writers are authoring in XML using DITA. They put their files in GitHub. And the product build environments, build systems, wherever the developers store their code, that's where the Swagger files live. And then the REST API publishing app will pull that, and it's transformed and published. And here's some information about GitHub. It's really nice place where you can, in case you're using different source control systems in your company, which can sometimes happen in big companies, GitHub is one place where everyone can access, and they can, you can point to files from there. And here's some information on their great help for getting set up in GitHub and Git, and in case you want to learn about this. So let's look at some useful tools if you're working on REST APIs. It's really, really important for to be able to try the REST APIs yourself. So in order to do that, you can use a client. And here's some examples. On the top, that's the Postman client. And on the bottom, there's the Advanced REST client. So one of my developers likes this Advanced REST, so that's what I end up using. But you can choose any number of these, and you can actually run requests against your API and try it out and test things and so on. Here's one example, and this is actually a blog that I found about using one of our REST APIs to register a device on the Internet of Things. And this is Pascal Brockmeyer. He's a consultant, but he was showing how to do it and using Postman. So I thought that would be interesting to include. And here's some sample REST clients. Some of this information came from my colleague Guru BS, who he compiled the list, and I've added to it and updated a little bit. But these are, if you're using different browsers, some types of clients you might want to install. And then here's a desktop one. I haven't used that too much, but some people may prefer that. And then there's the command line, the curl. So you can install that and set it up and use that. So where to go from here? There's a lot of great ways that you can learn about REST APIs. One thing, my friend Tom Johnson has this API class. He's constantly adding to that, and it's free. It's on his site. One thing I like for people who are just getting started and really need to start from ground zero, I don't know if that applies to anyone on this call, but Peter Grunbaum has some great online courses on Udemy. And if you go to his site at SDK Bridge, you get a discount. And I think they're about $25. Sometimes he has different discounts. So it's a nice low-cost way to kind of really get up to speed. Ed Marshall has a workshop, and SDC did a webinar series. She has Sarah Maddox, Joe, on code samples, which is really a good one. Tom Johnson, and Guru BS and I also recorded one, Best Practices for Docs. And the SDC Intercom did a nice API issue edited by Tom Johnson. So those are some useful topics that you could take a look at. And here's some more helpful information for people who are interested in automating REST API documentation. Tom Johnson did a podcast with Peter Grunbaum. Peter Grunbaum is a consultant based out of Seattle, and he does a lot of work on automating. He can set this up for a company if you have no resources in-house. And I have links to the programmable web where you can see research, and they have a whole bunch of APIs you can play around with. If you haven't gone there, that's a really great site. I like to follow Kin Lane. He is the API evangelist, and he really cares about API docs, and he has some really interesting posts. I have a Pinterest where I read an article or something that's interesting to me. I always post it in my API Pinterest and keep it there. So there's some other references here that you might want to take a look at. So to summarize, here's what we looked at. We talked about the introduction kind of to APIs and why they're so important. And remember that survey says that developers think documentation is the most important of just about anything, clear and accurate documentation. So we're all in the right place here. Best practices, we shared some of those. I talked about the getting started and the reference information and so on. I gave a demo of how one company does this, how my company, the process we've developed. I shared some tools and some more resources where you can learn, where you can go from here. So here's a summary again of those best practices we talked about, ways to help developers get started as quickly as possible, make them feel comfortable, and then once they're comfortable, they can refer to your useful reference information that will help them, become experts. And it's, again, important to provide sample code in the languages that they use. And it's so useful to provide a list of REST endpoints. That can be the key way that they navigate. And ideally, you can represent your resources with a description language to automate and make this, make sure that your docs are always accurate and reflecting the latest code, and provide a modern, usable user experience. So if you could share a top takeaway now, I'd like to see in the chat, or let's see if we can look at some of the chat. Can you show the chat window? Let's see.
Yeah. Marta, I guess that was invisible, but I will also enable the microphone rights for participants.
Okay, perfect. And I see that somebody has their hand raised. If you have your hand raised in a question.
All right, so I've opened the podium for questions, so go ahead. Okay.
So I don't see any questions yet, but you can, and you can also type your takeaways.
Yeah, I had a questions from Kiran, and she asked, my question to Marta, will it help to know a software language like Java or Python to write effective API documentation?
Will it? I'm sorry. So the question was, will it help to know a language like Java
or Python?
Yes. Yeah, it will help to know a language. Definitely. If you do know a language, that would be superb, because you could actually write your own code samples. Sometimes people write them themselves. Like my friend Joe Malin will write his own. He's actually a programmer as well as a writer, so he writes his own. Other people don't. They request them from a developer, but you'll be so much more valuable to your company and to your team if you can write your own code samples. Yes, that would be great.
Excellent. Any other questions? All right.
Can you talk more on REST? Okay. Oh, and here's, let me just see if I can scroll to read these more. See, Sangeeta says, how do you keep the sample code up to date with changes in syntax? That is really key. So, Sangeeta, that's why we've included, like in my team, we included the testing of the code samples. We include that in our we have monthly releases, so we have to include that in the testing process, because you really do need to keep the sample code up to date. It almost turns out to be like the sample code is almost like its own project. You need to have, definitely testing and expertise to monitor that. Once you added it, you can't ever forget that. You might need to keep it up to date. And then Manoj says, can you talk more on REST endpoints? Would help if you could speak more on what they are. Yeah, let's go back to, I'm going to look at my slides on REST endpoints. Let's see. Hold on. Okay, so here's an example of the REST endpoints. What they're going to include is the well the name of whatever the task that they're doing, the method, and then the path. So here's a list, or I can actually, yeah, it's probably easier to do it in this slide. So here's a list, for example, on the right on this slide, and it's showing the method is post. Create a service instance is a post, and then you would use post with that path and fill in your information. It's basically the tasks.
Yeah, so if you're showing some slide, we can't see anything.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let's see, how do I go back to my slides? How do I go back to sharing? Let's see, I think I need to, start.
Can you minimize the window? Can you minimize the chat? That's can.
Oh.
Okay, so I can just hide it, yeah. Yeah, now you can share your screen.
Okay, sorry about that, everybody. I'll share my screen again. Okay, so for example, here is a list of the REST API endpoints. This one is for the Java. So you can see that it includes the task that they'll be using, the method, in this case it's post, and then the path. And you do that for each one that you have in your API. So for example, all these tasks that you see here, all of these, each specific one is going to have a REST endpoint. So it's basically like a table of contents. And one nice thing is if they're so this way they can quickly scan through. They can look through all their, all the things that are included in your REST API. And then I said that it's really nice to be able to scan by path or by methods. So now we'll see, for example, all the gets put together, so they can look at all the gets, they can look at all the posts, and so on. Or they could go by path, so that would be alphabetically by these. So for example, here's view all service instances. It's the same path. You see how it's the same path as the create? So if you're viewing it, you use a get. If you're creating it, you use a post. So some people like to view it by path or by method, which is this part, the get. They want to look at all the gets. Then they want to look at all the posts and so on. Or they could sort by task. Okay, so I'll let's make sure can folks see my next slide? Yeah. Okay, so I just are there any other questions that people have?
Just wanted to know, Marta, if it's possible to shed some light from a consultant point of view on what are the kind of projects that you see in REST API from an independent consultant point of view. What are the kind of projects that we see? Where do we see REST API for a technical writer? Because you did mention marketability of technical writers, this thing. So what are the kind of projects that we see when it comes to REST APIs and technical writing?
Yeah, for consulting, you mean for consulting tasks? So people will probably want you to write the reference information or write the code samples. So just like any other consulting project, you would be taking on this. One of the big things that I keep hearing from people, is that they really want to automate this, and there aren't good tools yet. So right now, people have to actually manually create some process, and they can set up their own tool, but there's nothing you can buy. There's no vendor that's really selling a whole package for this. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of consulting opportunities for kind of setting up the automation and the web API, the web user interface. So if you have those kind of skills, you're probably going to get a lot of consulting, opportunities, as well as just consulting for developing a REST API for a company. And again, if you don't have the ability to automate or do a nice, web interface, there's always just a lot of call for just documenting these in any kind of tool. And a lot of companies are coming out with REST APIs.
Excellent.
Any other questions?
Yeah, there is a question from Rachna. Did you get a chance to answer that? Is it advisable to use actual piece of code from project to be used as a sample code in API?
So is it advisable to use an actual piece of code from a project? No, usually no. Most companies would have rules against that, where you can't actually show your actual code. So you really need to write an example. And no, it's probably not good to use the actual thing, but you could maybe you could use that as a model if that would work for your team. But usually you don't want to give away your actual code.
Okay. This I think is a very pertinent and very important question. Kiranmai asked, what are the common mistakes that writers commit while writing API documentation? Based on your vast experience, Marta, if you can shed some light on that.
One of the common mistakes that I've heard from a lot of people is that they don't test. They don't test their own, code samples, or that they don't have, some kind of testing set up. So that's really important. And not spending enough time on the getting started. It's so key. Developers really want that accurate and complete information, but they always need to get started easily and quickly. So it's so important to actually devote your time. And although you may be rushing to actually document all the technical part, that getting started part is something you want to pay attention to. And plan time for that, because that's actually pretty tricky to plan the exercises to get them up to speed. So you want to make sure you do include that.
Excellent. Any more questions before we conclude? We still have 5 more minutes, but though I know Marta has to go to or she's still in office.
No, worry. I have plenty of time. I just want to make sure that if any other questions come up, I want to thank you. And please connect with me. You're welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn or any of these places. I'm on Twitter, Facebook. So please connect with me. And if anything else comes up afterwards, please let me know.
A couple more questions, actually.
Yeah.
Pallavi asked, isn't the API doc for internal customers? If so, then why can't the code samples be actual? On similar APIs help the developers.
So the question is, why can't we use actual code? Is that what the question is?
Yeah, you can read in the chat box, but isn't the API doc for internal customers?
I'm not able to see it right now. Let's see.
Right,
you can, maybe that's okay with your company. Many companies will have a policy not to do that. So just check with your legal department and find out, what your code sharing, what your company standards are. So I just want to issue a caution. I don't want to tell everyone to do that, because you may want to check first what your corporate guidelines are and what your legal department says.
All right. So basically, do whatever you want, but get the approval first.
Yeah. Make sure you don't get yourself into trouble. Yeah.
Venkat has a question. What are the tools used to generate the API?
What are the tools used to generate the actual API? You mean the API documentation? Is that what you mean, Venkat?
I guess yes.
Yeah. So what are the tools? We actually use an API. So we have a REST API that does the publishing, and it gets the information. I showed that one slide where it gets the kind of getting started information written by the writers, and then it gets the we input the categories, those major groupings of the table of contents, and then it gets the Swagger for each of those. And then it pulls that and it's transformed into HTML, put into the HTML templates, and then it's published. So we're actually using a REST API to do that. And I know there are some folks internally to Oracle, so I can share more about this internally for the folks in the Oracle. We can do a separate internal meeting on that if you have questions.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So, any forums for sending questions and receiving the answers?
Forums for, if you want to ask directly to me, feel free to connect with me and ask me questions. I would say you mean, are you for specific industry general forums? Just look around, look for information. I usually follow people on, like Programmable Web is a great place. You can ask questions of, like if you're taking a class by Peter Greenbaum, you can ask questions and they'll answer them in Udemy, and so on. So hopefully there's, if you have any unanswered questions, please connect with me afterwards.
Okay. All right. So got one more, Manoj. How do the docs get published to Oracle Help Center? Do you have EPUB, MOBI, and PDF formats of the API docs, or only the HTML format?
Here's how it looks. So this is how it's published. It's just published as this HTML, and we provide the ability to print. At this point, you could obviously print and make it in HTML, and then with the download, we get the Swagger, as I mentioned. So you can download the Swagger, and that's it. Those are the formats on the Help Center. So,
all right.
Thank you very, very much for joining me. I know we have a few more minutes, but I know it's really late for you in India. So I just want to thank everybody for coming to this session, and I really appreciate your time and look forward to, hearing about your projects. So please, let me know if anything else that you need more particular information, and share your projects with me. I'd love to see what you're doing. So good luck with all your projects.
Marta, do you think you have a couple of more minutes to take a few more questions?
Yeah. If there are more, yeah.
Deepti asks how technical writers should work with source control.
So Deepti, how should technical writers work with source control? Well, if you're doing the process like we're doing, you would put your files for the getting started in GitHub. Somebody else may have a different process, but that's what we're doing. So we're using kind of this common source control. And then what we're also doing is updating the Swagger content. So the writers could, it's ideal if the writers can get access to where the developers have the code, and that they get access and permissions to edit the Swagger. Because as I showed you, this Swagger here includes a lot of text. So here's an example, a description. It returns a list of all available patches for Oracle Java Cloud Service instance. So that actually needs to be edited. If not edited or then written by technical communicators. So it's ideal if you do have access to the source control for the code, so that you can write or edit these little code snippets.
Excellent.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we have one more. Manjunath, when this REST APIs are being developed by the developers, is it normally this well formed what you demoed now, or does it require a bit of formatting effort?
It typically requires a bit of reformatting and a bit of effort. So there's probably a lot of troubleshooting to get get the Swagger really clean and so on. We actually have, my company, we actually have kind of tests set up to make sure that it's well formed and to make sure that it conforms to company standards. So yeah, it could take a little while to get the Swagger code just right for the, to display in online like that.
Excellent.
So allow some time for that, allow time to get that set up.
Excellent. Excellent. So, guys, on behalf of the STC India chapter, I want to thank Marta especially. Thank you so much for first of all, for taking up at your time and showcasing REST API to us, and also taking up lots and lots of questions. And I hope that you will be back with us again and present more webinar sessions with that. It was really very insightful, and thank you, Marta, once again. And to the rest of the participants, I want to thank you. It's already Friday night, and I know that it's not good to keep you discussing all this stuff and all that stuff. What I will be doing is that we have recorded the webinar, and give me a couple of days. I will try to upload it on STC India YouTube portal, and then first of all, share the link with Marta. Once she approves the link, and then only I will make it public. So give me a couple of days time, because it takes a little bit of time to organize webinars and also this thing. I also want to thank all of you, especially, and also STC India Admin Council for their support. Kiranmai is all there in the panel. She has really supported, and all those who made it success. Once again, thank you. And thank you.
Thank you.